Hey everyone, Diego with Listener's Notes here. Today I wanted to give you guys my top 10 worst albums of 2017 list. Now, I feel I should remind you this is my list, it's not your list. If an album you like is on here, it's not a personal attack on you or your taste. I just didn't like it. Feel free to tell me why I'm wrong in the comments. Feel free to tell me albums that I missed or should have included on this list in the comments. These are just the albums that I heard and I had a negative reaction to for whatever reason. We'll get into that as we go through the list. Before I start, I do have a couple honorable mentions though. Logic with his album Everybody, which I think is one of the most shallow and just boiled down attempts at racial commentary in a hip hop album this year. It's really not interesting, and Logic continues to show that although he has a nice flow and although his production is actually pretty good, his lyrics are consistently just terrible as it comes to these last few albums. I've been just disappointed with his ability to write some meaningful lyrics. And my other honorable mention is the band Temples with the album Volcano, which is just a really bland, uninteresting psych rock album. It's the production is really wimpy, it's really flaccid. The songs really don't do much for me. It's just overall a sleepy listen. It doesn't have the kind of fire that a psych rock band like Goat or King Gizzard or any band of that style really should have, in my opinion. I'm just not very impressed with this album or this band overall. But anyway, let's get into the list. Number 10, we have Lights with Skin and Earth. Lights is a pop star who actually I was pretty high on after hearing her acoustic album last year where she remixed some of her hit songs acoustically. And it wasn't the best thing ever, but I was like, wow, if she's really trying to do this, maybe her next album will be a bit more ambitious. She's going to pay more attention to writing good songs. She's going to focus on just doing the best thing she can to stand out. But no, this album, Skin and Earth, is just some of the most boring, generic pop, EDM kind of stuff I think I've ever heard. Singing isn't very good. The instrumentals are dime a dozen. They're not very memorable. They're not very interesting. There's nothing here worth paying attention to or listening to. Again, that kind of sums up the album, and that's why it's at my number 10 spot. At number 9, we have 21 Savage with Issa. 21 Savage to me is just one of the most boring trap rappers we have. His monotone and just low volume delivery, along with his flow, just don't do anything for him. Album is just like it's a really long album. We have these freestyle takes where he's just going nonstop without any interesting lyrics, without any interesting flows. His voice is very uninteresting. And this album, it doesn't even have good hooks. The beats are mediocre. There's just not much here. If he was able to put together some solid hooks, maybe an occasional punchline that I cared for, I could overlook the delivery. Look at an artist like Rock Marciano. His voice when he raps is quiet, it's understated, but what he says is grimy, it's gritty. It's actually what 21 Savage thinks he is. 21 Savage isn't scary. He isn't gritty to me, at least. I don't get much from what he says or what he does, but again, that's just me personally. At number 8, we have Hopson with No Shame. The name of the album actually perfectly explains what's happening here, because I feel like Hopson probably has no shame in any of the things he's saying, but it's some of the cringiest, just most awful things ever. First of all, he has this concept about like this girl in Australia who was cheating on him or working at a strip club, and he just couldn't have that happen or whatever, which is not a very interesting storyline to begin with, and it's barely executed because only a third of the songs on the album have anything to do with that. And all the songs about that are either really cringy or boring. Then we have Hopson on some really disgusting, like, graphic sex songs that no one ever wanted to hear, one of which being the worst song I've ever heard this year, Happy Ending, which is just racist, disgusting. It's just a terrible song about an Asian massage parlor and paying for sex there. It's just some of the most tone-deaf rap I think I've ever heard. He actually has a song on here where he's rapping to his kid with that girl who they broke up or whatever, and he's like, oh, it's all your mommy's fault, you know? If I see her again, I'm gonna beat her. Blah, 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 blah. Like, are you rapping that to your kid? Like, seriously? That sums up the album. It's an album for Hopson's fan base. that's that. At number 7, we have the Chainsmokers with Memories Do Not Open. And this is just really boring pop. It's the Chainsmokers. They've kind of become iconic for this at that point. At this point, just dime a dozen EDM with the same freaking 3 chord progressions. Just nothing worth paying attention to. The singing and the lyrics are shallow. The instrumentals are very repetitive. And this album, if you're listening to it from front to back, it's just so painful the further you go because there's no variation as you go through it. It's actually a very painful experience. At number 6, we have Starset with Vessels. This was an alt rock kind of album with like a space theme, which when I first heard it, I was pretty hyped for it. And sure, I haven't listened to alt rock like and enjoyed it really since I was in middle school and high school, I guess, like freshman year. But whatever. But for me, the space theme, first of all, isn't executed very well. It's kind of like some tacked on electronic elements. They put some vocal effects on the singing and the screaming, which sounds awful in my opinion. It's grating, but not in a good way. But besides that, I just felt like I got dime a dozen alt rock and post grunge kind of stuff that would have been big in the 2000s and kind of isn't big anymore for a reason. I don't know. I was just really bored with this album. It was really uninteresting, and I don't really get the hype. I know there are a lot of people who love this thing, and more power to them. I wish I enjoyed it as much as they did, but for me, it was just a painful, boring experience. At number 5, we have Ed Sheeran with Divide. I This album isn't made for me. Let's start there. But wow, is it boring? Ed Sheeran, he just manages to be completely uninteresting on almost every song. Whether he's being really like distasteful on songs like New Man, or just very uninteresting on songs like Shape of You, where he does this awful dance hall thing, which is not good at all. Or we have typical Ed Sheeran songs where he's singing on acoustic guitar, he's doing a folky thing. But throughout this album, for me, Ed Sheeran doesn't interest me in terms of his instrumentals, which are very clean, very sterile, very flat and uninteresting. His lyrics, which are not emotionally potent at all. If he's talking about like women and stuff, they're not interesting. He doesn't give any interesting stories or narratives. And any other song about his life just doesn't do anything for me. Even the emotional ones just kind of leave me cold. And his singing it's Ed Sheeran. He's a fine vocalist. I personally am not huge on his voice, but I see the appeal of him. I don't think he's a terrible singer. I think he's pretty good, but that's really all he has to supply for me on this album. Everything else was really not there. Even the songwriting was pretty copy and paste for me. It was not anything that I was blown away by or like wowed by. At number 4, we have Big Sean and Metro Boomin with Double or Nothing. Big Sean is a rapper that I have kind of a negative relationship with. I can admit that. I'm not really a fan of much of his stuff. But the whole Metro Boomin endorsement, I was excited. I was ready for this album. And I was so let down song after song. Even though Metro Boomin brought some pretty interesting beats. Sure, they're just trap beats, and they're not enough to carry a full album. They were pretty good. Big Sean himself, though, dropped the ball, and this is his worst rapping on any project that I've heard. Not just the punchlines being bad, or the content being bad. Some of the rhymes don't rhyme. The flows at times are choppy, and he has to like shove extra syllables into lines to make them make sense, and it just sounds awkward. It's really just some lazy writing, in my opinion. He really could have taken more time to really hone these verses. I'm sure they still would have had a lot of his bad punchlines, which are especially bad on this album, but still, it sounds like he just phoned it in. And now we're into the top 3. At number 3, we have Future's self-titled album. For me, this album was so boring and so dull that I just didn't even go on to listen to Hendrix. Future just ended up making some of the most repetitive trap I think I've ever heard. For one, he didn't have any features on this album, which was a bad choice to be in with. Two, we all know that Future, he's not a very good singer. He's not a very good rapper. He can't carry a full album like that 70, 50, 60 minutes, however long it is. He can't carry this thing from front to back with no other vocal help. The beats, besides the Mask Off beat, which was pretty iconic, I can give it that, and I liked the flutes and the sample they incorporated there. And I think there were a couple other beats too, but a good chunk of them didn't even really go that hard or weren't really bangers. Some of them didn't even have much in the way of bass or interesting samples. It was just copy and paste trapped percussion. So snare, hi-hat, snare, hi-hat. I mean, it's so meh. It's so boring. And when Future doesn't add anything else on any of these songs, no lyrics, no singing, no rapping of interest, there's not much to get out of a project like this, even if it did have its moments with songs like Mask Off. At number 2, my second worst album of the year is Falling in Reverse with Coming Home. I don't know what I was expecting out of an album like this. I probably should have known that I wasn't going to like it, but part of me heading into it just had a lot of hope, and I can't quite explain why. But this is just really terrible. First of all, this is like some pop punk kind of ish with super clean and sterile recording and production. It takes any energy out of the performance. It just saps it clean, makes it sound almost mechanical and robotic because it's so cleanly produced. The guitars, they're just mixed in with the bass. There's not a lot of interesting things happening with any of those instrumentals. But the real cringe show is the lyrics here, which are super edgy, super angsty. They come off like they're written by a 13-year-old who just wears all black. They're really basic, really generic, and actually kind of some of the worst lyrics in this vein that I've heard in a while. In a way, it's almost funny. Like, if you want a good laugh, pull up your Genius and play this album and go through it. It's hilarious how bad the writing is on this album. That's kind of why it got my number 2 spot. It was especially garish with how terrible the writing was and how dime a dozen the music was. And my number 1 least favorite album this year was from Eminem, titled Revival. I mean, I didn't think I'd ever come to this. I mean, Eminem gets a lot of hate every time he drops an album. It's usually to an extent like unnecessary, though he has dropped a lot of bad music in his career. This album, though, was continuing a trilogy of some of his worst. Relapse, Recovery, and now Revival. 3 of his worst projects. And still, this one is the worst thing he's made by far. This isn't even... There's nothing Eminem's made that's anything like this. I don't like a single song on this 19-track, 80-minute project. Every single instrumental on this album is either a terrible, sleazy rock beat that just butchers the original song in samples, a watered-down, bland trap beat, or a dime a dozen pop EDM kind of beat. And all of the features on here are pop singers. I've seen people trying to defend this album, saying it's not supposed to be an album that everyone likes, it's a work of art. Well, if that were the case, he probably wouldn't have been putting so many mainstream beats and so many mainstream artists on this album. It seems like Eminem instead was trying to appeal to a massive audience, and according to the reception he got, he pretty much failed, because this album has been panned by just about everyone. Kind of the reason I didn't actually finish my review on this thing. I just figured that I'd be beating a dead horse at this point. But wow, this album impacted me in just the worst of ways. I'm baffled that this is what his final product was. The hooks are worse than a lot of Eminem hooks, which is shocking because that's usually his worst points. But consistently, there's so many bad hooks on here. It's either Eminem singing, which is a recipe for disaster already. We either have that, we have some just corny Eminem-isms, like the hook for Framed. He's just like, well, I've been framed, which is just stupid. We have over-dramatic pop hooks, because anytime you have a pop singer on an Eminem song, they have to throw their voice in really over-dramatic ways, and no one actually sings like this, but It's an Eminem song, so we have to. And yeah, and lyrically, this is actually some of his weakest material as well. A few of these pop songs have really generic content that isn't very interesting. He has songs like Bad Husband where he's essentially rapping about nothing. Like, it's such a stupid concept for a song. You're really not saying anything that a listener would care about unless they're super fans of Eminem. Um, the punchlines are especially crappy at times on this album. We have some moments where he's trying to dive into political songs, which, although his execution is terrible, I like the content, but then he'll throw in these punchlines that completely take away from the point of the song. If you're going to do a punchline, make sure it enhances what you're saying on the song, not takes away from it. And he ends up taking away from it every freaking time. It's just baffling that this is the album. I know I've said that already, but I don't know what else to say about it. I don't have many positive things to say about it. It's passable at times. There's some mediocre singing at times. There's some interesting flows at times when Eminem isn't doing the repetitive, overused, choppy flow that he uses on this entire album. Every single song, no matter what it's about, it could be like this really quiet piano ballad that's supposed to have a really mellow vibe, but Eminem still has to bring this choppy, staccato, rapid fire flow that makes no sense. If I keep talking about this album, I might not ever stop. So I guess we'll just stop it here. We'll stop the video right here. That was my list, 10 worst albums of the year for me. Again, I want to know your list. Tell me some albums you hated. Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.